So this dot point is dot point 8. So this is a model stress. So we are looking at both the strengths and limitations of this particular model. And this looks at stress as a psychological process with reference to Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping. Now, within this model, we are looking primarily at what is going on in the primary and the secondary appraisal. So if you recall, Selye looked at the non-specific stress response within rats in this gas model. And what he discovered that regardless of the type of stressor, eustress or distress, we actually all have the same physiological response to stress, i.e. the physiological experience of stress is non-specific. Now, we know that there were issues within his model in so much as he didn't really consider the psychological components of stressor as a whole. So essentially what Lazarus and Folkman have actually done is they've developed a model to explain the individual difference in the stress response. Now, what they suggested was that there were cognitive processes involved. Essentially, what they're looking at is that an individual's perception and assessment of the stressor determines whether or not they'll experience stress. So stress is subjective, and that's really, really important to know, okay? So this is really a key point. Stress is subjective. Essentially, it focuses on two psychological factors that determine the extent to which an event is experienced as stressful. So we're looking at the meaning of the event to the individual and the individual's judgment of their ability to cope with it. There are a number of psychological factors that cause or influence how we respond to stresses. They can include things like personality, our general outlook in life, which is like optimism versus pessimism, other kinds of pressures, past experiences, so on and so forth. So essentially, the encapsulation of this model is here in red. So it proposes that stress involves an encounter between an individual, okay, and their external environment. So the individual, like their personality, optimism, past experiences, and the external environment, so the stressor itself, and that stress depends on the individual's interpretation, which is primary, of the stressor and their ability to cope with it, which is the secondary appraisal. Okay, so once we have appraised something as stressful, we will move on to three different further assessments. Now, our first assessment is harm loss. So this is an assessment of how much damage has already occurred. So for example, I have already lost my job. I have already failed my uni assessment. I have already crashed my car. The second one, or the second assessment, is a threat. So this is an assessment of harm loss that may not have yet occurred, but could occur in the future. So this is negative, but the damage has not been done. So for example, I have lost my job, okay, that's harm loss, but now I may not be able to afford my rent and I may be evicted. Now, there's potential for damage there. Has it happened yet? No. Could it happen? Yes. I could not sleep the night before the sack. The damage has been done, so that's harm loss. I might fail my sack. So again, there's potential for negative effects. However, the damage has not occurred as yet. Now, the last one is challenge. So this is an assessment of the potential for personal gain or growth for the situation. So this essentially is this idea that there is a positive element to this stressor, and this is the one that you would most associate with eustress. So for example, I have lost my job. However, this is not the field that I trained for, and actually I would really like to retrain and do another job. So there's an opportunity for that. This might look like I have been studying really hard for my SAC. I've done all the right things, and I'm excited about the possibility of doing well in my stack because I might get a really good study score for psychology. So again, there's potential for gain and growth. So to recap, with harm loss, the damage has been done. With threat, the damage could occur in the future, and challenge, there is potential for positive gain. Okay, so after the primary appraisal, we then make the secondary appraisal. So this occurs either directly after the primary appraisal, or it can even occur almost simultaneously. And this is a much more conscious process, I suppose, than the primary appraisal. That is very much an unconscious process. So within the secondary appraisal, we evaluate our coping options and resources and our options for dealing with the event. So we have both internal and external options and resources. So internally, it might be our personality, how healthy we are. It might be the fact that we're optimistic, we're resilient, what have you. Externally, it might be how much money we have saved, social support, housing options, how flexible your teachers are, again, so on and so forth. So essentially, if we perceive that we have enough coping resources available to deal with this stressor, then we're much more likely to feel like we are experiencing eustress. If we perceive the demands maybe outweigh our resources, so we actually don't have the resources to cope with the stress, then we're much more likely to perceive that situation as distressing. So, for example, let's say you crash your car and you don't have a car. So, I mean, internally, you might go, okay, well, I'm pretty positive, I'm pretty optimistic, so I know that it's not the only car I'll have. Externally, you have money saved to get a new car. Maybe you had insurance, so you can use that money to buy a new car. You weren't hurt, which is maybe more internal. But overall, it might be annoying and it might be stressful, but you probably have the resources to overcome the stressor. So it becomes more eustress. Maybe you get excited because you can buy the new fancy car that you wanted. However, if you crash your car and you're not determined, you're pessimistic, you're really upset about the loss of the car. Externally, you have no money to pay for the car, you didn't insure it, and you therefore have no resources to buy a new car, then you might perceive that particular situation as much more distressing than if you actually had more resources to cope with it. Okay, so given that this is a model, we need to make sure that we are aware of the strengths and limitations. Now, essentially, I would advise you to know 2 strengths and 2 limitations. So let's have a look at these. So in terms of strengths, this focuses on the psychological determinants of stress over which we have control. It stresses the personal nature and individuality of the stress response. I really quite like that. It views stress as an interaction with the environment in which the individual has an active role. So this is much more active than Selye's model, which was a lot more passive, I suppose. It respects personal appraisals of a situation, thereby interpreting the situation from an individual's perspective. So really it emphasizes this idea of subjectivity. It explains why individuals respond in different ways to the same sorts of stresses, and it allows for the fact that stresses and the circumstances under which they occur can change over time. So this actually allows for people to reappraise a stressor and actually change their initial stress response of the situation. So what are the weaknesses? It's really difficult to test because of the subjective nature of the individual stress response. I think that's a really interesting negative. Individuals may not also always be conscious of all the factors that cause them to experience stress. We can experience a stress response without ever having thought about a situation or event. So appraisal is maybe not necessary. It overlooks the physiological responses, so it only really considers the psychological elements. Primary and secondary appraisals can interact with one another and are often undertaken simultaneously. And the primary and secondary appraisals are difficult to isolate for study as separate variables. I think that's an interesting one too.